Today we're talking about potting up some of these indoor plants that maybe you have started. Now maybe you don't know what potting up is. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about 3 reasons why you need to pot up and a couple mistakes that I don't want you to make before you take these indoor seeds that you've worked so hard on and plant them out into your garden. So first, let's talk about what you need for potting up. So what we need for potting up today are a couple of items. You're going to need something a little bigger than what you had your original seedling in. So you can see these are a 6 cell. These are your epic cells. I love these. These are a little smaller than these 4 packs here. So it's a great size to pot up into. You don't want to go too much bigger than the original size, but you want to go up a bit. Now, if you don't have these, I also used to use these all the time, and I save these from the garden centers whenever I purchase any kind of plants. And so if that's something you want to use, you could pot up into that as well. I like these because they're just so much easier to work with and things don't get root bound at the bottom. So you're going to need some bigger cells, and always remember you're going to need some kind of labeling. You still have to label every single thing. You will never remember, trust me. Then the next thing that I use is a potting soil. Now, when we originally did our indoor seeds, we used a starter seed mix, and that's a little bit different than a potting soil. A potting soil is going to have slightly different ingredients and it's going to drain a little bit differently. But one thing you have to know is that these little guys right here need more nutrients at this point, and so a potting soil is going to have something like that. Now, I always use organic. So some kind of potting soil, something to plant them up a little bigger than you had before, and your labels, and we'll be ready to go. Now, one thing you have to note is that before you pot up, you want to make sure that you have at least 1 set of true leaves. Now, the first leaves are called cotyledons. So the very first leaves that come up are not true leaves. And you can even see that they look different than this leaf right here. Now, that is the first true leaf. So you don't want to pot up until they have at least 1 set of true leaves. If they're just cotyledons, you want to wait. So let's talk about the 3 reasons that you need to pot up, or I should say when you need to pot up. Well, what you'll start to see is that these plants will outgrow these smaller cells. These aren't very big. So when you see them start to get really big, one thing you'll want to do is look on the bottom and see if the roots are starting to show. Now, I know on this one in particular, you can see it pretty well. The roots here are really starting to come out and they start to circle. Now, the nice thing about the epic cells is that they really don't get root bound because they can come through the sides and there's a bigger hole in the bottom. But when we're talking about these kind of trays especially, you'll really see that the roots get root bound because they really don't have anywhere to go. And so they start to circle at the bottom. Once that starts to happen, it's going to impact the health of your plant. So we want to pot up around when that would happen, before when that would happen if possible, into something bigger so those roots then can continue to grow down and the plant can grow. So that's the number 1 reason that most people pot up. The plant is simply outgrowing this particular little tray. The second reason that I pot up is when I see a plant that's not doing great in the current cell. So this one is a perfect example. Now, if you look at this, you're going to see these 2 little tiny leaves on the bottom. Those are the cotyledons, and those are your first leaves. They're not actually true leaves. They're called cotyledons, and they hold a lot of nutrients that will help the plant and seedling grow. But at some point, these die off. And once that starts to happen, the plant is going to depend on nutrients from the soil. Now, these starter mixes, they have a little bit of nutrients, but not a lot. And so when I see a plant sort of start to stall, like this one has really just not been growing at this point. It's been like this for a while. It's cauliflower. It really should be doing as great as the broccoli. Then I know it probably doesn't have any nutrients left. And so at that point, I'm going to pot up and I'm going to use that potting soil that will have more nutrients into a slightly bigger shell, and that should help it thrive again. So if you see a plant starting to stall in its growth, it's probably time to pot up. The third reason that I pot up is I sometimes densely plant my seedlings. And so you'll see that some of these trays have like 2 to 3 plants growing in each cell. And that is fine for me because I can definitely pull it apart gently and pot it up. If you're a beginner, I would say just have 1 plant per cell. That's going to make it a little easier. But if you do get 2, it's really easy to just push that little cell up and split it and put it into separate cells. So I will actually pot up if I see that I have a lot of double plants per cell, because I'm going to get double plants that way out that I can garden out. Some people will snip them all off just so you have 1 left. That's fine as well, but I like to use all the plants that I can, and you can do it this way. It's not going to harm them. You'll actually be surprised. You don't have to be super careful. You just don't want to break any roots or break the plant, obviously, when you're pulling apart. But it's a great way to get even more plants, because you'll usually put in 2 to 3 seeds per cell, and if they all germinate, you can technically use them, but you'll want to pot up in some way so that then they have enough nutrients to keep growing. If I were to keep them like this, where I have like 2 in a cell, they won't grow that big because they're fighting for the nutrients. So that's the other reason that I would pot up. All right, so how do you pot up? I've got my potting soil in here. I did put a little bit of earthworm castings, so you should have a really nice fluffy soil here. And this is different now than a seed starting mix. So the potting soil is gonna have a little more nutrients for these bigger plants. Now you've got your bigger cells, and if you don't have the epic cells, which I happen to love, then you can always use just something maybe you got from the nursery. I always save all of these from plants that I buy at the nursery. You can pot up into that. So first things first, let's fill up your cells with your potting mix. Now you don't want to pack it down too much, but you want to make sure that all those air pockets are sort of out, and sort of fill it up to the top like that. Now I have been dying to pot these up because they are so ready. Now this is my cauliflower. This is one that just has stopped growing. It just needs more nutrients. The cotyledons have died. And so I've got my tag here. I'm gonna go ahead and put it there because you'll never remember, trust me. You must tag and label all your plants. Now the great thing about these epic cells is that I can literally just push through the bottom. There's a nice big hole in the bottom and it comes right out. I'm gonna go ahead and just sort of push down and make a nice big hole so that it just fits all the way down. Now you can kind of see the root structure here. I don't have a lot of root bound because it's got these epic cells, give it a lot of space. So I'm gonna just make sure that I plant that all the way down, make as much space so it fits pretty well and aligns with the soil line. And then I can just sprinkle a little bit more on top. Now this guy is going to thrive now because it's got a bigger space and it's got potting soil with more nutrients in it. And it basically just didn't have any nutrients left in this small little cell that had seed starting mix. So again, look at, there's a nice big root coming out of there. I'm gonna just give it some space so I can just directly push it down and it'll fit really nice. And one more. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly this guy sort of pops back into life because it's really stalled in its growth, which is one of the reasons that I talked about as to why I will pot up when that growth has stopped. All right. Now, I happen to have some spinach here that I had in an extra cell, and I want you to see there's 2 of them. So I will gently pull these apart. Now, I find it easier to do when it's a pretty dry state. I don't water them right before I do this, and you can just gently split that into 2, and now I'll be able to put this into 2 different cells. It's gonna grow a lot faster now. It's not competing for nutrients. So we'll put this here. And I hope you're thinking, I hope she gets a label. I do know what spinach looks like, but let's go ahead and label it because every time you think you know, you forget. If I'm right, if you do that too, comment below. Tell me I'm not the only one. Okay, so spinach. So all of these are now potted up. Let's go ahead and water them in. I'm gonna give them a really good soak. Now you could bottom water, but this very first time I will give it a soak from the top. And I wanna make sure that the entire thing gets a lot of moisture because it's the first time this soil is getting wet. And once you feel like everything is fully saturated all the way down to the bottom and you can see it dripping out the bottom, you're good to go. And at that point, you can put it on a tray and put it back under your grow lights. Unless it's ready to come outside, you need to harden it off. Please check out this video about hardening it off. That is a huge mistake that you'll make. If you think that this is ready to go outside and it hasn't been outside ever, you need to make sure that you harden it off. So that's potting up. And so I'm gonna do that with all of these plants now. I'm gonna put them all in a slightly bigger cell, not too big. Now let me tell you, if you go too big and you think, well, I won't have to pot up again if I put it in a really big pot. The problem with that is that technically the moisture control is a lot harder. And so the plant doesn't necessarily thrive in that situation. The plants thrive when they kind of go from one to a slightly bigger to a slightly bigger. But if you take one in a tiny little cell and then move it into a big pot, not only is it harder to keep that moisture exactly right for it to thrive, but the plants just don't do as well. It's like they like to ease in. So don't make that mistake of going too big too fast. These are the epic cells. I'll put details in the show notes below, but if you have any other questions about potting up, definitely leave a question below. I'm happy to answer it, but it's a great stage because it means we're almost ready to get into the garden.